Hi everybody, my name is Pascal Batzel. I would like to welcome you for this short introduction of a sample course of MT535, A Theology of Suffering and Joy. I usually start the course with one of my favorite verses, which is to be found in Habakkuk 2:14, where it says that the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the water covers as the sea. I remember very early on in my missional journey in the Philippines how that words really started to grow in my heart and started to shape the way I think about God, the way I think about His mission, the mission today, my missional involvement, and so forth. But as that vision started growing in my heart of seeing the whole earth being filled with the glory of the Lord, at the same time working in the Philippines, I started to encounter a lot of suffering, of injustice, of children growing up facing homelessness, of young men or women facing incurable cancers, of families losing everything through natural evil. And in all of that, as the vision grew in my heart, I started, of course, asking, where is the glory of God in those places? So even as the vision burned in my heart and pushed me on to continue engage in what God was doing, um, I started asking myself critical question that I think most of us come to a point to: why did God create the world the way that it is? Or in very despairing situation, where is God in that? For a lot of my unbeliever friends, this is one of the key questions where they start questioning if God even exists. If there is a powerful God, why does He not intervene? And for us Christians, we might ask the important question: how and what is God doing in the world? Or even sometimes, what in the world is God doing? So when we start thinking about suffering, we do need to be first reminded that this should not be a merely academic pursuit or an intellectual exercise that we want to do in this course, but that suffering, or that we discern answers that are really born out of actual experiences, because suffering is an experience. Or stated otherwise, the aim of this MT535 course is to explore the connection between ideas about suffering, so the whole theory behind it, but also personal experiences of suffering, which could be through case studies or to personal sharing. So we explore in the course that connection between theological conviction and practical experiences. Suffering, of course, raises many difficult issues. Harold Kushner, in his best-selling book on suffering, for example, states that this is the one question that matters, and only one, which he says, quote, "Why do bad people things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? All other theological conversation is intellectual diverting," end of quote. Just to get some background when we talk about suffering, the technical word for that is theodicy, which comes from the Greek word diakaio, which basically means to justify, and theos, which means God. So theodicy in that sense is an attempt to justify or to defend God in the face of evil. The attempt to vindicate the existence of God or other the powers of God against this kind of challenge. This is what we know, what we talk about when we use the word theodicy. So theodicy deals with the question of why innocent people suffer due to, for example, earthquakes, tsunami, tornadoes, and other natural disasters that they have no control over. It deals with question as to why people get cancer without any reason. And while some people are unfortunate recipients of, for example, genetical passed down diseases, when they have nothing done to deserve those diseases except to be born. So theodicy is the question: are God's way just? So theodicy then tries to seek a justification for the reason and existence of suffering in the world that we live today. There's a famous quote from philosopher David Hume, who wrote, quote, "Is he, God, willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil?" Question mark. End of quote. Perhaps John Stackhouse puts it best when he asks the question, quote, how can God be all powerful and all good, and yet evil afflicts us so widely and so deeply? End of quote. So this is what we will start to talk about in this course, to look at different theodicy in trying to see those different theodicy in how they explain natural evil, in how they explain moral evil, and so forth. And we'll start the course with looking at first the world that we live in. So natural evil, for example. And we start to see that, of course, we live in a creation that is good. But that does not mean that the creation is perfect. While at the same time, to say that God's creation is not perfect, of course, is not to say that moral evil makes it imperfect. We live in a universe that reflects both God's glory and beauty, which would not exist without suffering and pain. So we cannot just put suffering and evil being an existence after the fall, after the first disobedience of humankind. But at the same time, suffering is a constant reminder that we live in a world that is good but not perfect. A world that reflects both the obedience and the disobedience of God. So when we start looking at suffering closer and evil, we start to realize that it treats some of the deepest convictions of ours. Whether we are aware it or not, we all cling some kind of to the belief that the world is orderly and has meaning and a purpose. And when we start experiencing suffering and evil, some of those convictions are shattered. So throughout the course, we really try to look at stories, and we read stories like the one from Elie Wiesel, Night from the Holocaust, devastating and horrendous stories. We reflect on our own narratives to start really have context where we want to concretely reflect on understanding the suffering and evil in this world. And then we will look at 7 different theodicies that has developed over the last 2000 years, from the early fathers to the modern time, to contemporary scholars working on providing theoretical lenses or theological convictions on understanding and interpreting suffering. Some people might drawn to some particular theodicies, and others will see little value in that, and that's fine. Important is that as we go through those different theodicies, that we don't see them as final answers, but as roadmaps, or providing some kind of a lens to understanding suffering in certain contexts, and providing some very practical, specific also pastoral, missional steps, but they should not be seen for more or less. Now, we don't have time to go, of course, through all those theodicies, but I will just briefly mention who they are. The first one is the perfect plan theodicy, and basically that one interprets that all suffering is part of God's perfect plan. The second one, and that's probably the most widely believed amongst Christians is the free will defense. That suffering is a result of human free will and the suffering we have because of the decision of man. The third one is the soul-making theodicy. This approach finds meaning in how suffering changes us for the better. The third one is the cosmic conflict theodicy. That one you find often if you live outside of the West, which basically recognizes the role of the devil or evil forces who directly or indirectly causing suffering. The fifth one is the openness of God theodicy. And basically that one sees that God doesn't foreknow the choices we make. He only foreknows the possibilities. But how we actually exercise free will is only known to God when we start to act upon those decisions. So this approach is also quite common with the free will approach. The sixth one is the finite God theodicy. So God is not all-powerful, so when the bad things happen to good people approach, basically. And the last one is the protest theodicy. That one is that there are expression of outrage, focused primarily on God, against the terrible evil, and claiming actually that no God could actually permit such kind of evil in this earth. At the end of those 7 theodicies, of course, we'll look at both the strength and the weakness, and we will realize that no one theodicy will be able to fully comprehend or fully provide a lens to interpret suffering and evil in each context. As mentioned before, they provide good roadmaps. And generally, from what I identify in those different theodicy, they provide 4 different ways of understanding or interpreting suffering. We don't really have time now really also go into that detail, but in the course we'll try to really understand what can we learn from them, so that we are in situation of experience suffering and evil. Your colleagues, your missionaries will have tools to really provide some kind of a lens in drawing out meaning in those situations. Now, when we look at generally, for example, humanity, from an anthropological point of view, of course, each culture tries to provide some kind of meaning to the experiences of suffering and evil. So that's then another step when we look at the theories and philosophical approaches to suffering and evil. We'll look also from anthropological point, and just briefly to mention 4 major approach. Peter Berger identifies them, and where he looks at the first one to be the moralistic culture, that basically starts to emphasize that we should live differently, as suffering are the causes from the past, and therefore the responses today would to be good. Another one would be the self-transcendent culture, that calls sufferers to start to think differently, in seeing that suffering is an illusion, and therefore the response should be a detachment of the world. Of course, here we see the religious system that developed in Buddhism, the first one in Hinduism. The third culture is the fatalistic culture, which emphasizes one's destiny to be noble. So the response today should be to endure the suffering in order that we'll receive the glory and honor of God. And the fourth approach is the dualistic culture, which aims basically to put one's hope in the future. As there's current a cosmic conflict occurring, which the only response then could be to be faithful in embracing what is happening, because the hope lies primarily in the future, when finally the victory is won and good will overcome evil. Now, there's a famous article by German philosopher Max Scheler, which is entitled The Meaning of Suffering. And he examines the different approaches, which of course are cultural, but also religious systems have developed out of them. And he then argues that from all those different approaches, Christianity is actually quite unique, because the teaching of suffering from the Christian tradition seems to be complete reversal of attitude compared to other cultures and religious views. And of course, in the course, we also will talk a lot about also secular cultures, what kind of understanding there is, and that there is also a lack of really understanding suffering and therefore being able to respond to suffering and evil in this world. And so we'll come in the course on a point to really start to understand the complexity. And when we start looking at the scripture, actually the beauty of scripture and Christian tradition is that there is not a one way of understanding suffering and evil in this world, but scripture advocates a multidimensional approach. It does recognize that there are great diversity of forms, of reasons for, and therefore also right responses to suffering and evil. So in the second part of the course, we move away from the more theoretical and theological and philosophical discourses of theodicy into identifying practices of theodicies, which has an aim that the church start to embody a theology of suffering and joy. So this presents a mode of theodicy that does not seek to explain suffering and evil in this world, because in the end there's not one ultimate answers, but rather it presents ways in which evil and suffering can be resisted and transformed by the Christian community, and in doing so can enable Christians to live faithfully in the midst of unanswered questions as they await God's redemption for the whole world of creation. And we'll do that by looking at biblical truths that we have identified, and then start to examine them and seeing how can they then be embodied within the Christian communities. We start then to look at a lot of pastoral theodicy in how do you respond if you face yourself suffering, or if you encounter suffering in the other, if you encounter the other experience evil and injustice. What are appropriate responses to situation like that? And we'll realize that a lot of common phrases we might have, that God has a perfect plan for you, God is in control, and so forth, that they can be actually quite damaging. And just as Job experienced those merciful comforters in life, we as missionaries or as pastors, our words can be actually quite misappropriate and can actually be quite hurtful. And so we go through really looking at what would be more appropriate missional and pastoral approaches to really encounter the suffering and evil in the other. And then we look at identifying different practices of theodicies we look at, for example, practices that often are very underdeveloped in the Christian communities and in our missionary organizations, where we have certain emphasis but might miss others. So we talk about, for example, the practices of lament. What does that mean? We talked about listening in silence, forgiveness, thoughtfulness, hospitality, and so forth, all to really try to be able to develop or start to embody a theodicy of practices that really provides concrete and tangible ways in which God responds to evil. And then we'll start looking at, start realizing that also from a theological point, we bring them into dialogue with a theology of joy. So when we have developed a good theology of suffering, we provide that discourse with a theology of joy, because they are not two separate things. But in Scripture we see that joy is not despite of suffering, but that the biblical theology of joy can also be developed because of suffering. We see that, of course, in Paul and other Christian writers, where we start to look historical how that developed and bring that dialogue together, really developing joy as a spiritual path in seeing how God creates those missional spaces where His presence is manifested, where the true joy, of course, is in context of great suffering and evil, and that He provides ways of how we can learn to receive joy despite maybe some very daunting obstacles. And Mary Moschel knows that joy springs from that connection between and among such finite and fragile creatures as ourselves. It's in that human connections that we can start to make rooms and creating spaces for joy, and that we can develop and learn them. So the course then will really try to enable missionaries and pastors to attend to that gift of joy, which has the potential power to really contribute to the healing and hope in this world. It is what Jesus says in John 15:11. I said all of these things to you, that your joy may be complete. So a theology of joy revolves around an understanding of God being good, beauty and life and love, and that despite all evil and suffering in the world, the presence of the Holy One is the one that is among us. So we don't have now time to really go deeper in how to really develop that skills of discerning joy and caring for joy, and how important that spiritual path is in dialogue with suffering. But that will be at the end of the course, where we look at, of course, Scripture and Christian tradition in trying to understand of how they develop the theology of joy amidst some of the very concrete situation they were living in of suffering and evil in the world. So it is in the suffering and evil of this world that we can start to rejoice in the hope of Christ and His presence among us, knowing that He is Emmanuel, God with us, that He will never leave us alone. Paul reminds us that we are called to rejoice in our suffering, not because Christ that the pain doesn't exist, but because with Christ we're not alone. With Christ we do have hope and joy. So through suffering with Christ there is love and there is new life. So this course hopes to develop that biblical understanding of a theology of joy, that when your missionaries and your pastors will take that course, that they will really have a strong theology of joy, that when they encounter persecution and suffering and evil, they will respond out of that wealth of scripture and tradition in resisting that evil. So that course is really designed to really intentionally reflect in how we can build a Christian life and Christian community that absorb suffering and evil and enable us to live faithfully in the midst of evil, where we can share and receive the source of true joy, which is only to be found in God's person, work, provision, rule, and His presence. Thank you very much for listening for this course, and I look forward to maybe see some of you in the full 10 weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.